Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Air pollution and climate change impacts can have outsized effects on the national park system, as well as lesser noticed but just as concerning effects. But are those impacts spread across the entire park system, or just clustered around a few? This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Back in 2019, the National Parks Conservation Association looked at how air pollution and climate change were impacting the parks. They have updated that study with the latest data from the National Park Service, and the current state of affairs remains concerning. To discuss NPCA's findings, we've asked Ulla Reeves, the interim director of NPCA's Clean Air Program, to join us. We'll be back in a minute with Ulla.
Embrace the perks of an interior federal membership, where our benefits can save you up to $2,800 a year. Take advantage of discounts on insurance like auto, home, and AD&D. Shop for travel deals. Get a discount on password security and identity theft protection too. Discover all Interior Federal has to offer. Learn more and apply at interiorfcu.org. Federally insured by NCUA. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Ulla.
Thank you so much for having me, Kurt.
First off, this report was built around data the National Park Service gathered in 2021, so just 2 years removed from NPCA's 2019 report. Do you recall what year's data that report was built on? I'm guessing probably a couple years before 2019.
I may need to get back to you on that. I actually don't have that quite off the top of my head. I think that data may be more likely 2018 or 2017 or something.
Okay, so we're more than 2 years removed from the latest data.
Yes, we are. But it did take us some time to process this data for various reasons and get this out and published.
Sure. No, I was just wondering from the standpoint of, how quickly things are changing out there across the landscape. I know air pollution long has been a problem for national parks, and climate change impacts are more recent, but to be able to measure differences even between just a handful of years is concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the National Park Service is regularly taking this data, accumulating this data and information. We are taking this data and processing it and putting it into story form so that people have more accessible information than just raw data. So we are definitely seeing some interesting trends between our study last time and this one this time, but knowing that data was from our newest report, the data underlies from 2021. We were still in COVID, essentially, and we did see some decreases in some of the big categories of the air pollution effects. We did see some big changes in the hazy skies and the unhealthy air categories of the air pollution. And hazy skies refers to the visible air pollution that is affecting our scenic views. And that same air pollution is causing unhealthy air in a lot of instances. And so we did see some drops in that. Unfortunately, I don't know that those drops can be counted on for the future. There are many reasons that we are continuously concerned about the impact that air pollution is having on national parks. And one of the biggest outtakes from our report is that in the harm to nature category, we don't see any improvement at all. And that really reflects that national parks and the ecosystems and nature that are in those in most of the national parks. Of course, some of our parks are urban and monuments, but they also are often home to natural ecosystems and provide a bit of a buffer. But parks can't escape air pollution. And what we see is that national parks in particular, we're seeing that cumulative consequence of air pollution affecting nature as pollution is deposited into soil and water. So nitrogen deposition, sulfur deposition, and then also the effects of ozone pollution on vegetation health. All of those underlying issues in that particular category of harm to nature, we see that there's not an improvement.
Yeah, we're going to dig down into those areas in just a minute. Starting off, though, reading through the report left me a little confused at times. For instance, it noted that there have been modest improvements from the 2019 report in both air pollution and climate change impacts, and yet the current report still notes that 97% of parks have significant or unsatisfactory levels of air pollution. And it adds that the number of parks with significant concern levels in at least one of the air quality conditions analyzed dropped from 96% to 70%, indicating some improvements in air quality. Now, at first blush, those numbers seem contradictory. Can you explain them?
A lot of it has to do with that harm to nature category. So what we saw is that there was a drop in the number of parks in the highest concern level in both hazy skies and unhealthy air. So last time we had more parks that were showing significant concern levels for both of those categories. And now we're seeing more of those parks falling into the unsatisfactory category. And so even though they're not at the top of the charts now, they still are not experiencing the clean and clear air that we expect national parks to have for both the enjoyment of a visitor's experience, but also for the health of people and rangers, and then wildlife and the harm to nature. So when we take all these categories together and look at this as one big air quality category, it is those really high numbers of significant concern in the harm to nature category that end up pulling numbers back up to that overall 97% of our parks are still experiencing high levels of concern, whether they are significant or unsatisfactory from any of these air pollution categories.
Yeah, can you put into numbers what differentiates a park when it has significant issues versus unsatisfactory conditions?
So it depends on which of the three categories. In the hazy skies category, what we're looking at are the deciviews of impairment. So that is a standard way of measuring visibility impairment. So when you look out over a scenic view over a landscape, that view is measured in deciviews by how much your view is obscured. So the significant concern levels, and I can get all those numbers for you, but the significant concern levels means a significant level of visibility impairment, and then unsatisfactory means that you still have hazy skies and you're still losing out on the color and clarity of views, maybe just not as much as the significant concern level. And then, what we're really trying to get is for our parks to have low concern levels of hazy skies. The parks are afforded the greatest level of protection for their views under programs like the Regional Haze Rule that is administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so that is the goal. And again, that's part of where those numbers are so high, is that we don't have many at all parks in our system that have low concern levels for hazy skies. And there's only 5 parks that fall into the hazy skies, whereas 387 fall into that unsatisfactory category.
Right.
Now, when you take so each air quality category has its own metric for how we break into significant concern, unsatisfactory, and low. When we take the unhealthy air category, that is based on the Environmental Protection Agency's National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So 70 parts per billion is the current ozone standard to protect human health. And parks that are exceeding at times the 70 parts per billion are in the significant concern category. And most of the parks in that category, unfortunately, are in California. Our top 10 national parks with unhealthy air are all in California. And actually, California has 5 total in that category, but also Rocky Mountain, White Sands in New Mexico, Guadalupe Mountains in Texas, and Indiana Dunes in Indiana, all are falling into the significant concern level for unhealthy air. And then in the unsatisfactory category for unhealthy air, it's parks that are below that 70 parts per billion, but again, still not reaching optimal air quality conditions that would truly be healthy at all times for visitors and park rangers and anybody who's outdoor exercising and enjoying their experience. Sure. So then the harm to nature category gets quite a bit more complicated because there are 3 components to the harm to nature category, which are nitrogen deposition, sulfur deposition, and ozone as it affects vegetation health. And so that category is a combination of metrics within all 3 of those, and then averaged out where we identify, how many parks are having significant concerns in any of those 3 categories, and then pulled together for that total number. In that breakdown, what we see is that the majority of parks are having really severe problems and very high levels of significant concern in the nitrogen deposition category. So 248 parks have significant concern for nitrogen deposition.
Yeah.
And that's really concerning. That's coming from agricultural, that's air pollution that is deposited into soil and water in the form of nitrogen. And then 244 parks have unsatisfactory concern in the sulfur deposition, and 37 in the significant concern category. So we're just seeing a lot of problems in that pollution that gets deposited into soil and water. And we see that parks just can't escape, right? Parks are exposed, nature is exposed to pollution 24/7, 365 days a year. They don't get to go indoors when pollution is high.
So, Ulla, one thing that really jumped out at me, the number that national park visitors are missing out on 50 miles of scenery because of air pollution. Not 15 miles, 50 miles. I mean, that's incredible.
On average. Yeah.
On average.
Yep. Absolutely. We can't underestimate the importance of being able to see our landscapes and experiencing those long range views or dark night skies. Pollution that is affecting our views, again, is also affecting our health and having other detrimental consequences. So when we can see the pollution, we are breathing it, and we are also missing out on some of the most fundamental experiences of our national parks. I mean, we know that many of our national parks have just some of the most stunning landscapes, and it is a really important experience of being human outdoors, is to be able to see our own reference point in a landscape and experience the awe of nature when we can have a perspective of our place in relation to the grandeur of nature.
Sure. And, for folks who've been to Sequoia National Park, climbing to the top of Morro Rock, you can see that haze and you can see that limitation in how far you can see. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you go to the top of Clingman's Dome. Thank you. Shenandoah, you can go on and on and on. And I was somewhat surprised in the list of top 10 national parks for worst hazy skies that neither Great Smoky Mountains nor Shenandoah National Park were among the top 10. And I remember, I've been doing this for a while. Traveler's in its 19th year. And I remember in the earlier years, the image, the picture, the side-by-side picture from, I think, Clingman's Dome of how hazy things would get on bad pollution days. And are things getting better at those two parks, or are things getting so much worse across the other parks?
Well, both a little bit, and again, the job is not done. So we actually have seen some big improvement in both Great Smoky Mountains and Shenandoah, but we can see from the fact that Mammoth Cave is still on this list because Mammoth Cave is not too terribly far from either of those parks, that we are still experiencing air pollution problems in both of those parks, but in both the Smokies and the Shenandoah, the concerns about air pollution over the last several decades got so, people were so concerned about them that there was a lot of action taken to cut pollution from coal-fired power plants and other facilities that were really having a huge detrimental effect on both of those. So we have seen some improvements. But Mammoth Cave is one of the most polluted national parks in our system. And we have states like Kentucky that are trying to do absolutely nothing to clean up their air pollution. And there are many states in the upper Midwest that are affecting, right? Air pollution knows no boundaries. So the pollution sources, coal-fired power plants, oil and gas development in the West, industrial facilities, any of these sources their pollution can travel hundreds of miles at times. So pollution in Illinois is harming Mammoth Cave, and pollution in Indiana is harming Mammoth Cave, and so on. So the job isn't done, but what we can see is that reducing pollution has effect. We can see the improvements when we actually take the sulfur dioxide out of the stacks of pollution, when we cut the nitrogen oxides. And we need to be doing the same thing with carbon dioxide and methane and climate pollution.
Sure. And of course, one thing that goes unsaid is the impact of that pollution on human beings. When you're out hiking, ozone levels, and for the elderly, for younger, for people who have medical conditions, the ozone is a serious situation. And I know the Park Service used to have a web page you could go to that would give you current level readings of ozone in the parks, so you could judge for yourself whether, hey, it's a good day to go for a hike or a bad day.
There still are those, that information is still available for some of the parks. Visitors should definitely know to check air quality before they go to a park, particularly in the summertime when the temperatures are higher and pollution does its chemical dance with sunshine and other pollution, and ozone levels can be a lot higher. It depends on the location, but absolutely, when we are exercising, young people in particular, our little ones and the elderly are more susceptible to breathing in polluted air. So we do need to be mindful to take care of ourselves, because this pollution is a reality. And just because we're in a faraway national park does not necessarily mean that the air is clear and healthy, even though we would hope it would be.
Sure. What about the pollutants? Are there different pollutants in different parts of the country that are creating problems, or is it widespread top 3 pollutants that are affecting all national parks?
The big pollutants that we see that cause regional haze and ozone, and the unhealthy air, really we're talking about fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. And air pollution gets very complicated in chemistry, but those are the big ones that are contributing to all three of these problems in their various forms. We do see pretty widespread pollution of all three across the country, where there are coal-fired power plants that have uncontrolled sulfur dioxide emissions in the Midwest and the East in particular. There are some really big SO2 emission problems, but vehicles are also a big contributor to particulate matter and sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. So in a place like California that doesn't have coal-fired power plants, we're still seeing, the California parks are really getting hammered by air pollution, and a lot of that is from so many vehicles on the road that have uncontrolled tailpipe emissions. And oil and gas development contributes to this problem too. So it's a pretty widespread issue, but there are some geographic variations from time to time. And then seasonal cycles can change the way air pollution settles into certain mountainous areas. Salt Lake City is an example that tends to have really high particulate matter, smog problems in the wintertime because of the trapping of the pollution, essentially, and the way the air settles in the wintertime.
Sure, it's incredible. I live about 20 miles east of Salt Lake City, and you have to go up over Parley Summit, which is about 8,000 feet in elevation, and we can tell when it's a really bad inversion in the winter when you start to see that smog coming over the summit. It's really, really frightening, and we wish the legislature would do a better job in controlling these things, but I digress. And of course,
Utah is a great, sorry to interrupt, Utah is a great example of where there are coal-fired power plants that have been let off the hook for decades for the pollution that is contributing to haze. So that's it's really quite a shame in Utah that those Hunter and Huntington coal plants are contributing to national park air quality problems for a very long time and have honestly been let off the hook.
Sure. And you mentioned the impacts to nature. If you're talking about air pollution, a related problem with that is acid rain deposition. That you might have the coal-fired power plant in Utah, and the acid rain falls in Colorado, for instance. I know that's a big problem back east, or has been a big problem back east with Shenandoah and Great Smoky Mountains, the Appalachian National Parks, and you're getting all that air pollution from the Midwest industrial sectors, power plants that is being transformed into acid rain.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of improvement in the situation with acid rain in decades past from a lot of the cleanup of the coal-fired power plants that we were talking about earlier. But I think the findings of our report show that is absolutely still a problem.
Yeah.
And we do have maps. You were asking about some regional variation. We do have maps in our report that people can download that report and take a look at how things change across the country, depending on if we're talking about which of the air quality categories. And then we also have a climate change section that we can talk a little bit more about. But in the harm to nature category, we really see from the Southwest through the Midwest and into the East, particularly the Northeast, really those high levels of the nitrogen deposition.
Yeah. And for those people listening and wondering about the report and the maps, we will have links on the Traveler website where you can go to download that information. We're talking today with Ulla Reeves, the Interim Director of National Parks Conservation Association's Clean Air Program, about air pollution and climate change impacts across the national park system. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
So let's talk about some of the impacts on nature. I mean, a lot of us go to national parks to see wildlife, to add to our bird list. And there's tremendous issues going on across the park system, whether it's related to air pollution or acid rain deposition or climate change. I mean, invasive species, the joke I like to ask park managers is how long does it take an invasive species to become a native species? All these impacts are playing out in front of us.
Absolutely. Sticking with the air pollution category and looking at the three factors that we studied in the harm to nature category for air pollution. Well, one of the categories there is the ozone harm vegetation health. And what we know about ozone is that it can actually burn tree leaves and cause damage to the way in which a tree or a plant can photosynthesize.
Okay, I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit there. You said ozone can actually burn tree leaves?
Yes, ozone can actually burn tree leaves so that they can no longer photosynthesize the way they should be. And not just trees, right? But there are certain indicator species of plants and trees that are more susceptible. For example, the tulip poplar trees in the southeast are very susceptible to ozone pollution. Black cherries and other tree species are very sensitive. The other thing from ozone pollution is there are a lot of flowering plants like milkweed that are essential food sources for pollinators. Those plants are very susceptible to ozone pollution. And we know there's a new study out. We know that pollinators, moths, bees, butterflies, but this new study looked at how moths are unable to find the scent of the flower that they are looking for when ozone pollution is high. And that's so concerning because we know that pollinators are really struggling in today's world. And here's more specific information showing that our parks are struggling with ozone pollution. And it's not just the plants, it's not just the trees, but it's actually the pollinators, wildlife that are also being exposed to the air pollution.
Sure. And this wasn't mentioned in the report, and maybe it's beyond your knowledge, is certainly beyond my knowledge. But when you're talking about how ozone impacts vegetation and burning tree leaves and whatnot, and we're not talking burning with a flame, but kind of acidification, perhaps that type of burn. What about fall foliage? I mean, it's a huge economic driver in the fall for the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states. People want to go out and see the beautiful fall colors. Do you know if the ozone is actually having an impact on the vibrancy of the fall colors?
I don't know about that specifically. I think what we know about ozone affecting trees is that it is weakening their immune systems essentially. So I think it's possible there's a connection there. I don't know it specifically myself, and I'm not sure if that has been studied explicitly. But I think we are edging into the climate categories of our study, where we know that the consequences of climate change certainly are having also a lot of detrimental effects on the health of our tree species and can affect their vibrancy overall from year to year.
Yeah. Recently, the Interior Department announced that $195 million generated through the Inflation Reduction Act was being spread out across the park system over the next decade to look into climate change resiliency and adaptation or whatnot. And I know they're doing a lot of studies back east, or planning to do studies back east, on how streams are being impacted by climate change and how fisheries are being impacted, as well as grasslands. I'd be curious to see if during those studies they take into consideration pollution. I mean, we know that climate change has impacted the fisheries of at least Great Smoky and Shenandoah National Parks, because we see the press releases coming out that water levels are too low, we're going to halt fishing, or temperatures are too high, too stressful on the fish. We've seen that in Yellowstone National Park in the Rocky Mountains, which you would think would be somewhat immune from warming temperatures, but obviously they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. The cumulative consequences of climate change, I think, are really alarming for our national parks. And in our study, we looked at what we called the high risk climate threats. And there are 4 specific categories in this study. And we see that over half, really a majority of our parks, almost 60% of our parks, are experiencing the climate impacts that have the potential to cause irreversible harm to those parks from either drought, sea level rise, wildfires, or invasive species. And in this study, invasive species is specific to pests or insects. We also know, of course, that invasive species can be plants,
Sure.
but that's not included in this category for our study.
You know, the traveler spent roughly a year studying invasive species in the parks and the impacts they're having, both vegetation and wildlife, reptilian, and even mosquitoes in the Hawaiian national parks. And it is a concern, and it's great to see some of the progress that has been made in terms of, for instance, feral hogs. Although there's still a lot of work to be done, and the Burmese python situation in Everglades and Big Cypress, and the South American tegus that are entering the environments there, are all very concerning. And at the same time, we talk about pollution, and then you look at climate change, you look at invasive species. It's an incredible, daunting scenario that the Park Service has to somehow grapple with, and which visitors are being impacted by, and hopefully they're recognizing these impacts and reaching out to their congressional delegations and saying more must be done, more help should be given to the Park Service.
Absolutely. I think are very overwhelming problems. When we take them collectively, we find that 14 of our parks have multiple high risk climate threats, just of these 4 that we looked at. And managing those impacts can be really, really challenging, particularly when we think about budget cuts that the parks may be facing. And the other concern that we have about the budget cuts is that the air pollution monitors that are so essential to provide this information that we have underlying this report, those air monitors have been chronically underfunded now for a very long time, and the Park Service is having to make very difficult decisions about whether or not to even keep those air pollution monitors going. And how do they maintain them adequately? These are complex instrumentation that need money to keep them operating well and effectively. So it's we need that scientifically based information to tell us what's happening in the parks, and if the Park Service can't maintain those, then we are essentially flying blind.
So what are the solutions? I mean, I know there's a section in the report that talks about solutions, but at the end of the day, doesn't it come down to political will to see those solutions fully implemented?
Absolutely. But we know we have the tools in the toolbox to make some really good improvements. I mentioned the regional haze rule. That is a program that is designed to deliver and restore natural air quality to national parks. That came from a bipartisan congressional mandate back in the 70s that said that national parks should not have visibility impairment from man-made pollution sources, and that program is in effect today. And we have the opportunity to see progress made to reduce pollution from every state across the country, but there is limited political will, and we see a problem with the states being willing to hold polluters accountable for cutting their pollution. And so we need action at all levels to continue to make progress. The solutions are there. We know how to control pollution from industrial facilities, from coal-fired power plants. We need stronger rules on the books to address vehicle air pollution. We need to clean up tailpipes, because that pollution is definitely making its way into national parks as well, not just from the people who are in the parks, but from far away, because air pollution travels long distances. So we know how to do it, but we absolutely do need the political will.
When you talk about political will, and just recently we've seen Congress going through the budgeting machinations, and at first there was a pretty extreme cut to the National Park Service budget, and yet we'll get through fiscal year 24, but fiscal year 25, even the president has called for reduced funding compared to his last budget proposal. It's got to be concerning times in terms of, seeing that the Park Service has the resources, manpower, funding, instrumentation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's daunting.
It is daunting, but it shouldn't be so overwhelming that it paralyzes us. We all have a way to be involved in some level. Folks can take action through our action alert that exists, calling on EPA to hold states and polluters accountable for their pollution. There are little things that we can do like that, and then there are many other ways that people can be involved. So I hope that people aren't just so overwhelmed that they do nothing, because we are truly all part of the solution. And when we are active and we hold our decision makers accountable, together we can make change. And we do see that in our findings. We see that it is possible, and we know that we can make improvements to clean the air, and we must, for making reductions in climate pollution.
Sure. One thing that wasn't mentioned in this report, it's kind of a separate category, but it's pollution nonetheless. Microplastics, forever chemicals. Is NPCA coming out with a report on those two problem areas?
We don't have anything that I'm aware of in the works right now, but I am certainly aware, and you're not the first person to ask this question since we released this report. It is an emerging issue that I think that we all need to be concerned about. Microplastics. I'm not aware of any specific studies on it as related to the national parks, but I think that the Park Service may have some things that they've done.
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue. I know. I think it was a couple of years ago. There was a study that found microplastics in some of the high elevation lakes in Rocky Mountain National Park, and there was just a study that the Traveler reported on a couple months ago about microplastics being found in the scat of I want to say penguins at Galapagos National Park in Ecuador. You like to think of a faraway place that's on the other side of the world, as Master Commander would let you know. You would think that would be immune from the human impacts, and it's not. So definitely concerning issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of these issues, we see that no place is immune or untouched by human activity and human pollution. So.
Well, Ulla, it's been fascinating diving into this, and I hate to leave people with a depressed takeaway from this. But you have seen progress since the 2019 report came out.
We have seen progress. And again, I hope that this is all motivation for people to take action in some way in their own lives, whether it's calling their congressional representative or being engaged at a local level or supporting the parks in their own way. We want people to enjoy and love the parks. This information is educational information so people know that our parks aren't immune from the harms and the consequences of air and climate pollution. So we want to get this information out and let people know that our treasured natural and historic areas are experiencing the consequences, but we hope that it motivates and spurs people to join us in doing something about it.
That's Ulla Reeves, the interim director of National Parks Conservation Association's Clean Air Program, talking about their latest report on air pollution and climate change impacts in the national park system. You can find that report on NPCA's website, npca.org, as well as on National Parks Traveler. And we hope you'll download the report and take a close look at the findings. Ulla, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Kurt.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. You can find a copy of the report on both the National Parks Conservation Association website, www.npca.org, and on the Traveler's website. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.